Okay, so a couple of days ago, I did an article about Chris's imaginary family, and as promised, I wanted to do sort of like a follow up, an extended article, if you will, about some very, very serious concerns about the prospects if Chris should actually have children. Now, let's get the first part out of the way. Is that it's not for me to say whether or not Chris is actually capable of looking after children or not. It's not up for me to say that, well, Chris couldn't look after children, and but the problem is that it's all well and good to say that it's not within my rights, and it's because it's true. It's not within my rights. It's not within your rights. That's the sort of thing that can only really be determined by, let's say, the courts or even the state of Virginia or the US at large, and among other things, if it ever came to that. It won't ever come to that, but it's important to know is that we can't ever deny Chris his rights to have children. That's not even a question. Whether or not Chris is actually physically able to perform the task of trying to impregnate somebody, or even, as he claims it, to actually give birth himself by means of some experimental surgery in which he can have a uterus, as to whenever that takes place, or whether or not Chris's eggs go cold turkey long before that ever happens, is questions, and all of them can be answered with no, not in my lifetime, and certainly not in Chris's. And Chris needs to just face facts of some of the more important pressures. Now, for the first thing I will say is that there is the biggest barrier, I suppose, when it comes to Chris actually having any children, if he can actually have any children at all, is he first must actually find a female companion, a boyfriend free, and possibly a childless. So if Chris chooses, because, well, if Chris couldn't even look after somebody else's child, then what hope does he have of looking after his own? But, well, let's go into this into a bit more detail. Because if we are genuinely asking the question, then unfortunately even though I've been talking exclusively about Chris for months, even suggesting that if Chris should be allowed to or not is almost in conjunction with every single thing I've talked about Chris. Now, here's the thing. Parenting is an enormous task that takes huge amounts of effort and competency and love. Anyone who's ever watched the YouTube channel Seductive, which stars Human Name and his pet duck Wrinkle, it suggests something very, very interesting when it comes to actual parenting. And it could be whether you're looking after a human, your own flesh and blood, or an animal. You need to have a certain capacity for love. And at no point whenever the subject of children or Chris's alleged future child Crystal, whenever that's ever come into question, the subject matter of love has never been brought up once. Never ever it's been brought up. And I don't really understand if Chris understands this either, because here's the thing. It's one thing for a child to be born into a poor family. It's also another thing for a poor family to actually provide, scrimp, take extra days out for work so they can get by and stuff like that. There's no reason to suggest that effort is something that isn't going above and beyond. I mean, the famous writer and comedian Ricky Gervais came from a very poor family, and you know what? He was loved and raised, and guess what? He made something out of himself. Whether you want to say it's because he exercised, well, he certainly did. Well, not exercised as in physically, but he exercised his talents and abilities, and look at where he is right now. Absolutely. The problem is with Chris is the idea is that, unlike Ricky Gervais, Chris's parentage can best be described as, well, if Chris had younger parents, that might be different, because having kids well into your mid-60s is something I personally don't recommend. I can't say you can't or anything like that. Again, it's not for me to say what people can and cannot do. However, Chris's situation, and no doubt problems arising from parental cruelty in the form of Bob and possible mixed messages from Bob are it's going to cause problems, especially in the view of an autistic individual like Chris. Now, getting back on track for 1 second. As with Chris himself, even if you have two of the most loving parents imaginable, an unhealthy mix of stupidity, coddling, hoarding, manipulation, bad practices can easily turn any child into a monster. First and foremost, Chris is extremely negligent, which is a trait picked up from his own parents. For example, the hoarding, which eventually led to the 2014 house fire. No parent who, is responsible would allow that sort of condition to happen. And by the way, hoarding isn't just something that can just be solved as easy as just throwing stuff away. It's not quite as simple as that. However, it's the fact that Chris didn't want to challenge it either, and he just sort of learned to accept it, which is sort of a problem. I think quite a lot of for like kids who have like parents who are hoarders, I reckon that's sort of like a situation where the kids could literally just say, why can we have like a slightly cleaner condition and stuff like. It's standing up to their parents is the way it is, and they could throw the old, my house, my rules, that sort of thing. But again, it's not teaching. It's not giving your kids setting any standards. When the standards are set so low for how you want to raise for your kids' offspring and for how their outlook on the world, they're not going to aspire themselves to think of anything better for the future. And yes, kids do learn at their own pace and they mature accordingly and stuff like that. But you've got to give them some incentive to suggest that things can be better, and that there is such a whole world out there waiting for them. It's now, again, whether you want to say this is almost a diatribe from when Chris was homeschooled for several years, is one thing or another. I can't say for certain because I don't know exactly what the extent of Bob's parenting of Chris was when he was a child back in the 80s, but let's keep going. Name a thing in his life that he is tasked with taking care of, and you will quickly find that he has left them to rot and rust away. Even with things that he cares about, he doesn't take particularly good care of, and regularly leaves to break because he can't be bothered to actually take care of anything. Wasn't it the case of like Snoopy, who spent a great part of his life physically not impaired, but had great difficulty in walking because he fell off a pile of a mountain of clothing and fell awkwardly on his leg? Yeah. And those were animals as well. That was a poor animal. Children need attention and care, especially during their younger years when they're more vulnerable and they cannot take care of themselves. For example, can Chris successfully potty train a child when he cannot do the same with his own dogs or even himself? Well, obviously not, because, well, when it comes to this sort of thing, again, that's why aspects of like a healthier diet are obviously in question. And when the question of learning how to control and handle stress is paramount to the question. I mean, I very rarely suffer from stress, but again, I very rarely have caffeine these days because it does like awful things to my colon, and again, it's just but it's a good reminder about sometimes caffeine is just having too much of it is not good for you. And again, these are the sorts of things it's good to actually teach your children through. And you know what? Because there are some things that you can't really afford for a child to learn from in the future. Like, you don't want to tell your child that they're free to drive down a busy motorway, or if the stove is really too hot, or whether or not it's okay to eat glass or drink bleach. There are some things you can't afford a child to learn from mistakes, obviously. But that begs the question, how exactly is Chris going to go about... because having a kid is a 24/7 job. They are your priority from then for the rest of your life. And I don't think... if Chris can't have the commitment towards his own Solitude comics, something he claims is his own pride and joy, and his own creation, then what makes you think he's going to marvel at a physical, real being that is his own creation? This is exasperated by the fact that, paradoxically, despite Chris's obsessive desire to be a parent, he has no actual interest in parenting. In the comics, where he is both mother and father to Russell and Cynthia, he has Jeve Iglesias take care of them in lieu of showing them any attention for himself, with the two children showing obvious signs of parental abandonment. In the Playing House video, for example, Chris also makes it rather obvious that he actually intends to neglect his children, with Reginald being allowed to wallow in his own filth and vomit, while having not been able to talk to speak, while Crystal is expected to take care of herself despite being 4 years old. And bear in mind, in the same video, Chris seems to be under the misguided suspension of disbelief that he is going to be a stay-at-home parent whilst his wife is going out to work. Which is another thing I should also bring up into it, is that the relationship between mother and father is going to be incredibly different than when Chris is just dating somebody. You got to think about how Chris's poor wife or girlfriend or, wife-to-be is going to take care of the fact that Chris can't take care of himself, and he doesn't take care of himself enough to even bother going out to find work, in order to actually raise his own offspring. Which, in the prospect of women, that doesn't exactly sound like a very fair deal, and it's that level of just laziness and vindictiveness and selfishness is the sort of thing it only drives away more women than you can possibly believe. For every second Chris tries to pursue the notion of his children whilst not actually doing anything to change himself for the better, as far as society, or probably even for Chris even sees it, he's got no chance whatsoever. You shouldn't really be concentrating on the idea of trying to raise kids when you can't even look after yourself. That's probably the same reason why I'm still probably not going to have any kids. Probably not for if I reach 40 and I still don't have any kids, I'm pretty much gonna call it a day on that one. I think I may have said that before, but I'm absolutely laying down the law on that one, because again, I've got to be able to display that I can actually look after myself, live independently, and do everything else in between. I can't really do that and expect a woman to be to say the same thing again about what chance are people going to believe I'm going to be responsible if I haven't done anything to display it, such as Chris. It's not the sort of thing that women find attractive. Look at having kids. Children also cost money, and lots of it. Unfortunately for Chris, Virginia is among the top 10 most expensive states to raise a child in, around 8th place at an annual $23,029 a year. Which means that even if Chris was responsible with his money, he never will, he didn't have an ungodly amount of debt to pay off with, which he does, and didn't have a group of exploiters taking a giant chunk out of his monthly payment, including his live streaming money and his monthly tugboat, simply wouldn't be able to cover it. And that's assuming he has no other expenses. Chris will find some. Maybe he'll find some stupid rocks that he believes has the power of Jesus or of sonitude and stuff like that. It's these, or even if Chris literally made a living of literally going back to 14 Branch Lane Court and basically collecting gravel and selling it on the internet. It's not a career choice, and it's certainly not going to get Chris very far in life. Because it hasn't got him very far at all as we speak. Also, not to put a fine point on it, but Chris has virtually no aptitude for self-control and anger management whatsoever. Even if you were to argue that past conflicts have proven he is way too passive to assault anyone physically, the one lone case, a piece of vehicular assault and use of pepper spray notwithstanding, he'll just as easily settle for verbal outbursts and exaggerated temper tantrums in general, which can be scarring to a child as well. As documented, Chris did have a tendency to lose his temper at the smallest provocation and direct it towards younger kids during the time he went to the game place on weekends, which, among other bad habits, eventually led to the manager banning him permanently. In fact, what prompted such was Chris getting into a heated verbal dispute with a young card gamer. Top that off with Chris's insistence that everything he does is doing the right thing, and when it's demonstrably unacceptable, and his near inability to empathize with others nor acknowledge his own errors, not only attempting to apologize if he thinks he will get something he wants in exchange for doing so, and you have a recipe for what could be at best a strained relationship between Chris and his hypothetical children, if not them escaping and preventing further contact with him altogether, as his half-brother Cole did with Bob. Yeah, I can't necessarily say that there aren't good reasons for this, because how does Chris... That's the thing. Even when you're an adult, you've got to be sort of like on your best behavior at all times, online as well as in the real world. And Chris, because Chris doesn't want to be an adult, he wants to be a child forever, he's sort of not really caught on to the idea that, guess what, his actions have consequences. One of the most important things you could ever teach a child, and, well, it's just... Have you ever... You know the Family Guy episode, Brian's a Bad Father? Well... It's not quite like that, but I'm surprised that I'm surprised that Chris didn't even bother taking any cues from Family Guy about what not to do, because Chris comes to think of Family Guy as more stated in reality than the real world. So there's that. If anything, Chris will probably see himself more as Goku, but unfortunately not as the family man Goku, who constantly puts his children in danger, drives Chi-Chi round the twist. Yeah, I can't imagine that Goku is probably the aspirations for maybe a father figure. Possibly. And finally, while in the past it would be considered speculation or something an A-log would say, even regarding some worrying comments on Facebook, notwithstanding, but that gives you a better indication of the sort of things Chris will say and will do say, and things that can be found. Nowadays, it's obvious that Chris is okay with questionable consensual incest, especially parental incest between a mother and her child. Regarding his previous comments on Facebook regarding incest with one's own child, he was not only accepting over the act, but actually encouraged it, claiming said act was good experience for the child, only adding the condition that the sexual relationship should be abusive or hurtful, completely disregarding that not only sex with a child is by definition abuse, and by extension hurtful, because children are not able to consent to sex. In short, if by some miracle Chris was actually capable of conceiving children and somehow being allowed to keep them, they would grow up sick, hungry, penniless, neglected, abused, and or dead. That last one there about incest is, well, I don't really... If for no other reason, there you are, ladies and gentlemen. What sort of woman is going to put themselves in the family way with somebody who they know has had very, very... and bear in mind, Chris wasn't even trolled by anything or anyone back in 2016 when he said that about don't send the mother and son to jail, and frequently ignored comments saying that incest was not harmless, as Chris was trying to state. No, but it's the sort of thing that, again, it would probably forbade Chris from, forget sperm donation, but from adoption. It's the sort of thing that Chris wouldn't be able to adopt, because they'll take one look into Chris's financial records, into his criminal offences, his days in court, his debt, his reputation online, and, well... What do you expect? What do you expect's going to happen? Well, you think that they're going to roll out the red carpet, but as soon as they do, social services will be outside the door, and they'll be rolling the car door for the child to say, "Run, run, get quick, we'll take you back. We'll get you to a proper home, with parents who can actually nurture you, look after you, keep you in a safe home, will prevent you from things like debt." And again, that's just... I think that's really what I'm trying to get to at the end of this. It's not the idea that Chris shouldn't be allowed to have children. I mean, probably, well, actually, to be honest, maybe I should have changed my mind about that. Is that I might not be the person to say that to be the voice of the law or anything like this, but I am going to say no. If I was a woman, no, Chris would not be that guy. And, well, that is that. I wish it wasn't as bleak as it sounds, but actually it's in the best interest of everybody, because Chris would find out very, very quickly that, again, it all comes back down to what I said earlier, is that Chris, in all the times he's mentioned about wanting to have a daughter named Crystal, at no point has the subject of love even come into it. Because I wonder if Chris really understands the concept of love or the commitment about having a child. Sad, really, but again, there you are. And with all that being said and done, I cannot wait to see all of you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.